Jerold Duquette is a professor of political science at Central Connecticut State University. He is the founder and a senior contributor at masspoliticsprofs.org, where political scientists provide commentary and analysis. Professor Duquette's work on Massachusetts government and politics has also been published in the New England Journal of Political Science. He serves on the Longmeadow Historical Commission as well as the Parks Commission.
Now, calm down, everybody. Thank you for coming, all of you, the whole crowd. Thank you for coming. First, I'd like to start off with what I like to call sort of an origin story of the book. Gil pointed out that it really is a product of my association with the Mass Politics Profs. And Mass Politics Profs is a site that we started in the run-up to the 2012 election, particularly the election between Senator Warren and then Senator Scott Brown. And one of the things that led us to get into this space in the media was the very poor coverage, both mostly national coverage of the Warren-Brown race. The failure of sort of national media or even scholars from around the country to accurately describe or think through how a Massachusetts Senate election works caused us some despair. And so in that particular race, my very first post on Mass Politics Profs was about 6 months before Elizabeth Warren had even won the Democratic nomination, and the press was all a Twitter about, and there was no Twitter, but it was all a Twitter about Senator Brown being the most popular politician in Massachusetts and a really good campaigner, and it was going to be a real tight race. Well, we at Mass Politics Prof declared, 1, he's not going to win. 2, Elizabeth Warren is going to win rather easily. And that was something that caused a lot of ruffled feathers. But the reality was everybody was looking at the election in a very, in sort of a left-right, Democratic, Republican, American politics lens, with that lens, and that's just not the way elections work in Massachusetts. It's actually a very different animal. And so we ended up ruffling a few feathers because we kept telling folks what was going to happen. And then when it actually happened the way we said and not the way everybody else was saying, we started to get a following. And so we've now been at this for a dozen years almost, and it's been a great experience and a great opportunity for us to eventually get together and produce this book, which in many respects you will find bits and pieces of over the course of the last 10 years on the website itself. So that's my origin story. Why exceptionalism? Why did we grab that as a theme? When you're trying to produce an edited volume with multiple contributors with the goal of providing what one reviewer called one-stop shopping for an understanding of Massachusetts politics, that's a lofty goal, right? You got to have a theme. You got to have something that ties all the contributions together. So we wanted it to obviously serve, if necessary, as a college textbook, but we didn't want it to have to be that. We wanted to make sure that there was a useful theme, a compelling theme. Exceptionalism, of course, it's a sort of a fraught concept, right? American exceptionalism has a dual reputation for being a bad and a good thing. Well, Massachusetts exceptionalism preceded it, right? That when we all talk about exceptionalism, we point to the future Massachusetts colonists who basically pronounced that they wanted to be like a city on the hill, et And so Massachusetts has seniority when it comes to exceptionalism. And the thing about Massachusetts political culture that is also less well understood around the country is this notion that we do things better when it comes to politics in Massachusetts really has always been a consistent theme in sort of Massachusetts culture and politics. Even in the last 10 years, people in Massachusetts are constantly sort of talking about all of the number one rankings that Massachusetts has, whether it's public education or quality of life or various other categories. There's always something in Massachusetts for us to brag about. We really are massholes in that sense. It's a tangible, real thing that there's an arrogance in Massachusetts politics. One of the best chapters in the book is the chapter on political culture, and in that chapter there's a really great, vivid description by Aaron O'Brien, my co-editor, of the annual St. Patrick's Day ritual in Massachusetts, which unfortunately has waned just a bit because of the pandemic, but it's a breakfast. That when I was a kid, my memory was that to get into the breakfast, the politicians had to carry their own folding chair, had to climb up a fire escape and go in the window because that was the only way to get past the crowd. And once in, every year, these politicians all basically make horrible fun of each other. I mean, it's almost like a Dean Martin roast, but it's a Massachusetts politics roast. And it's a very, I always thought it was hilarious, but it's really an in-your-face. Massachusetts politics is an insider's game. Massachusetts politics is, we are sort of players in Massachusetts politics. There's never been a sense in Massachusetts that you have to hide the fact that you're a politician, right? Massachusetts voters are not susceptible to campaigns that seem to attack you for being a politician or even for being some kind of elite, right? I'm going to have to take a drink because I'm suffering from the Mark Rubio issue here. Hold on. Sorry. You may or may not recall that one of the things that Scott Brown attempted to do in his effort to defeat future Senator Elizabeth Warren was to keep calling her Professor Warren. Professor Warren. He thought that might help to make him look more like a regular guy. Well, in Massachusetts, trying to make your opponent look bad because they're a Harvard professor doesn't work, right? Not because everybody loves Harvard, but because that is a qualification that the average Massachusetts voter thinks is better than not, right? So trying to label your opponent a politician has always been a problem. And I mean always, like centuries worth of problems. I have always noted as a former intern and constituent of now Ways and Means Chairman Richie Neal, that every time I ever heard him speak, he literally says, "Thanks for helping me become a really powerful politician. And my career is thanks to you, and we're doing great, and I've got all this power, and I'm going to use it to help you." There's no hiding from it. And interestingly enough, whenever candidates run against these establishment Massachusetts politicians, whether they're coming from the left or right, mind you, they try to go after this politics as usual idea, which, as Americans, we are used to people saying, politics stinks and we don't like politics or politicians, but in Massachusetts, that tack has really never worked. Richie Neal has been challenged from the left and the right with that politics as usual, transactionalism, et cetera, professional politician instead of someone who's really concerned about the issues or really concerned about your taxes or whatever. That has never worked. The voters simply don't respond to that in Massachusetts. And that's an important actual point because around the country today, that is still the most vibrant, that's really probably the most, consistent theme you'll hear from challengers, whether they be challenging from the left of the Democratic Party or the right of the Republican Party. An attack on sort of politics as an activity, politics as a profession, right? But politics as an activity and a profession have always been essentially, if not respected, at least not, lampooned among average Massachusetts voters. They're a strange lot, right? Massachusetts voters live in a state that everybody else in the country thinks is, bright blue progressive state, right? The reality is quite different, however. The subtitle of the book, Reputation Meets Reality, obviously gives you a little tip that your assumption that the People's Republic of Massachusetts is where progressives go to feel safe and have, no challengers is flatly not true. And one of the things that led to our using the theme and writing this book was that we kept hearing from political scientists even, but certainly national media, we kept hearing things about our state's politics that we knew were flatly wrong. I'm going to give you a couple of quick examples of that phenomenon. In Massachusetts, obviously there is a Democratic and Republican Party, but you probably know that the Republican Party is not very. It's sort of an anemic crowd. They are only about 12 or 13% of the registered voters are Republican. But then again, only about 30, 35 are Democratic. So the majority of Massachusetts voters are actually independent or what we call unenrolled, right? So the reality is that we're not looking, when we look at the numbers, you shouldn't really expect it to be a really left-wing kind of a politics, and of course it isn't. One of the things that you hear, though, and I remember vividly when Deval Patrick was elected governor back a little bit now. He was the first Democrat since Mike Dukakis, and of course he had a veto-proof Democratic legislature. And all around the country, even political scientists who specialize in governorships were saying he's going to be the most powerful governor in America. He's got all these formal powers because he's Massachusetts governor, and he's now got a united Democratic front in the legislature. So this is going to be the chance of all those progressives to get the reforms and the policies that they've been trying to push through, but they couldn't because of Republican governors. Well, it didn't turn out that way, and of course, at Mass Politics Pros, we knew that it wouldn't turn out that way, because in Massachusetts, the Democratic legislature is, yes, they do have veto-proof majorities, and yes, obviously that it's not crazy for people from around the country to assume that that means policy would move left, but it isn't true either. Because in Massachusetts, the cleavage or the division in politics isn't between liberals and conservatives. It isn't between left and right or Democrats and Republicans. It's really between insiders and establishment-friendly interests and outsiders and establishment-unfriendly interests. And without question, the insiders' establishment-friendly interests have a huge advantage and essentially win many more elections than not. So DeVal Patrick, who ran as a progressive, did not govern in the way that he and his sort of progressive supporters had hoped. I noted that in his very short 2020 campaign for president, his big brag about having been Massachusetts governor wasn't that he accomplished a bunch of progressive things, but was rather that he had managed to push through pension reform and had managed to bring disparate sides together on a lot of issues. These are pretty vanilla, generic things, far less than what his supporters had assumed he would be able to accomplish. So in Massachusetts politics, you've got a very disgruntled left and a very disgruntled right. Right now, that right is represented by the Mass GOP committee, and the chairman of that committee is a junior Trumper of the highest order, who essentially is now, every time he supports a candidate, that's basically dooming that candidate, not because Massachusetts is a bunch of liberals, but simply because they're really opposed to extremism. And they're really not interested in hearing that politics is all corruption and politicians are all bums. And that's essentially what we hear in Massachusetts often from the left and the right. It is really those establishment-friendly, what we in political science call transactionalist politicians, which is to say they are happy to be considered professional politicians. They make cost-benefit, and analytical decisions about what to support and what not to support. And guess what? The voters are okay with that. The voters in Massachusetts, the average Democratic voter even, is not out there, beating the bushes for a candidate like AOC or right. We have seen some breakthroughs in Massachusetts of Ayanna Pressley is a woman of color who beat a very long-time congressional incumbent, and a lot of folks thought that this was a great sign for sort of descriptive representation in Massachusetts. After all this time, suddenly someone has broken through. The only problem with that is Ayanna Pressley wasn't just some activist; she was a very well-established politician with a real record. And so her win was the win of someone who is a professional politician who, it was more generational replacement in politics than it was an insurgent victory in politics, right? But again, the analysis from the rest of the country was, here's a great sign, AOC in New York, Presley in Massachusetts, just not right, right? Ultimately, she was a generational replacement for an older, generation of professional politicians, which she is a professional politician. Now, my co-editor who wrote about women in Massachusetts politics has some optimism with regard to descriptive representation, because we have actually seen other women and women of color winning. Obviously, the mayor of Boston is Michelle Wu, first woman of color to be mayor of Boston. That, when you just think of that picture for a second, an Asian woman as mayor of Boston, anyone who has ever had any sort of sense of what Massachusetts politics is like is going to be shocked by that. There's no doubt, right? There's no way anybody would have expected this woman, this Asian woman, to be in the spot that we remember sort of machine politicians occupying forever, right? She's in that spot, and she is, in fact, sort of an activist, right? But in her first year, she has face that dilemma of having to actually play that game, having to play that patronage game, especially as a mayor, right? Mayors have to actually do stuff, right? And so she hasn't really been able to pursue as aggressively as her campaign might have indicated a very progressive policy agenda because she's got to run the city, right? And that tends to push people back to more pragmatic, ways of doing things. So the big picture problem that we hope this book helps to address is it actually looks at Massachusetts from Massachusetts' perspective. It looks at the development of the institutions, the development of the political culture, the actual operation of various elements of our system, including the three branches of government, the parties, et cetera. And it does that without sort of being misled by generalizations that political scientists around the country use when they talk about state and local politics. That's one of the scholarly areas we found wanting, right? State and local politics scholarship, there's a hole in it. And the hole is, in our view, there's a lot of efforts to do comparative analysis. And that's obviously of value, right? But because you're comparing so many different things, right, it ends up defaulting to quantitative analysis more than not, producing generalizations that are like expectations that a governor in Massachusetts will be strong, when the fact is they're not strong at all. Massachusetts governors are actually exceptionally weak, which is usually surprising to folks in the sense that we've had these Republican governors, we've had the governors at the top of the popularity rankings, and we've had them even at the top of power rankings. It's just that the power rankings are wrong. And they're wrong. How am I doing? They're wrong because in Massachusetts, there really is a separation of powers. There really is a supreme legislature. Legislative supremacy was an idea that the framers had, and it didn't work out so well in Washington, but it actually seems to have worked out maybe as they intended in Boston, where the legislature, not only in recent decades because of a veto-proof legislative majority, but in fact, historically, the legislature has been the center of authority and power, and the governor has been a junior partner. In the last 30 years, that has been even more prevalent because of the fact that the Democratic Party has the veto-proof majorities in both houses. But remember, they're not they're not liberal ideologues, right? In fact, in Massachusetts, the folks that you see going to the convention, they're the party activists. The people that actually hold public office are professional politicians, generally moderate and almost even non-ideological, which is to say that when Patrick showed up and thought he was going to be able to push a lot of stuff through, they said, sorry, buddy, but this is how we play this game here. There are established interests, and we cater to them, and they essentially prevent us from having competition. And they've done a great job because Massachusetts is always either the first or second most uncompetitive state for legislative elections. So we have incredibly uncompetitive elections. We have a dominant single party. We have legislative supremacy. We have a bunch of characteristics that people would assume lead to a certain kind of politics. And in Massachusetts, in some cases it does, and in some cases it doesn't. In other words, it certainly hasn't led to extremism. One-party domination has not produced extreme state policy. In fact, if you look at Massachusetts policy, which you can look at various policy rankings in terms of progressive, level of progressiveness of policy, and they're always, in the top 10, but they're never in the top 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, right? So yes, in Massachusetts, there has been meaningful progressive reforms only recently, right? We've had meaningful reform of police conduct. We've had other meaningful reforms, but the way that those reforms happen in Massachusetts is sort of old-fashioned, political bargaining, old-fashioned political transactions between interest groups. That's essentially what happens in the Massachusetts State House. And to the great chagrin and frustration of activists on both sides, the voters seem to be quite fine with it. Unlike most other states, the Massachusetts voters, when polled, say that they do in fact trust the legislature, do in fact trust the governor, and have fairly high opinions of how well they're doing. That is obviously kind of exceptional, but it's exceptional in a way that is hard to understand when you're trying to apply what's happening in Washington or what's happening in other states. I'm out of time?
No, you got 2 minutes.
I've got 2 minutes. One of the themes that I think is really important in the book is this idea that the Massachusetts State House may in fact be operating in the way that the framers of the Madisonian framers, if you will, of the U.S. Constitution intended for the U.S. government to develop. We don't have essentially political parties in that sense, right? We do in fact have legislative supremacy. We do in fact have genuine separation of powers. And we do in fact have very civilized, not particularly ugly politics, right? The politics of Trumpism, et cetera, and all that, that's a sideshow in Massachusetts, and literally a sideshow, because we do have this Trump-like Republican State Committee, and they might as well be a comedy act, because they have absolutely no hopes of electing anybody, but they also are, for some reason, they think it's a good idea to keep banging that drum. It has never worked. It has never worked for progressives, and it doesn't seem like it's the best bet in the long haul. So it actually seems like, because the Adams Constitution of 1780 was the blueprint for the Madison Constitution of 1787, because we know that was a blueprint, it actually can be, I like to think that it could be said that Adams got it right in that sense, or that the state of Massachusetts has managed to balance, use institutional balance to moderate politics. It's certainly not a perfect analogy. Unlike the United States, Massachusetts has access to Article 48 in their Constitution, which is the initiative and referenda process. And here's a really important thing to know about that in Massachusetts. It's really a political pressure valve of sorts. And what happens is the legislature decides what they're willing to take credit or blame for and what they're not. And if there's enough political pressure to push something that's going to hurt the establishment politically, they just shift it over to the ballot, right? And the ballot then takes the hit, and leaving the governor and the legislature sort of without getting anything on them, right? So it actually serves as a way to reduce challenges, insurgent challenges to the established order on Beacon Hill, as I said, as a sort of a pressure valve. And what tends to happen is interest groups bargain for how that's going to go. And if they can come up with a bargain that's going to work for everybody, they settle it before the question hits the ballot and the question is tossed. So when you look at the institutions of Massachusetts politics, it's a very functional place, actually. But it's also a place that draws a heavy, heavy criticism from reformers of all stripes, whether they be progressive or conservative. It is a almost proudly, obnoxiously unreformed place, the Massachusetts State House, and that is usually something that surprises people from the rest of the country. But it's really the most profound thing you can say about Massachusetts politics. It has maintained a very establishment-friendly, SOP, standard operating procedures now for centuries.
All right, thank you. All right, time for questions.
I was struck from the very beginning when you gave the percentages of registered voters.
Right.
For the two parties. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how that plays into the primary system in Massachusetts and how that affects the structure.
Sure. Well, I mean, the primaries are now essentially open. I don't think, in other words, if I want to vote in Massachusetts primary, when I show up, I can pick either ballot. Right? So that says an open primary, basically an open primary, right? That has only been the case, though, I'm trying to think about that. Maybe, I hope I don't get this wrong, but I feel like it's about 20 years old, that particular way of doing the primary. So independents vote in the primary in Massachusetts, right? Lots of Massachusetts people are unenrolled voters who are encouraged to participate in the primary. So in that sense,
that has an influence on cutting down the extremism?
Well, certainly it does, absolutely. But I tend not to put a lot of stock in people's voter registration in that respect, right? I think there's a lot of people who are registered in unenrolled in Massachusetts because they think of it as the best way to avoid annoying mail, right? So I mean, there's a real strong streak of pragmatism in the average Massachusetts voter that frustrates activists tremendously. But the polling data keeps showing us over and over again that even if you are looking at those 35% that are Democratic Party registrants, their sort of ideological perspective is pretty much not much different than the 52% that are unenrolled. Right? It's really a non-ideological electorate, which we know is true of the average American voter as well, but yet there's always this strong sort of impetus to impose sort of more clear ideological motives simply because voters tend to be using their party loyalty, right? And in Massachusetts, obviously, there's strong party loyalty among those 35% that are democratically enrolled, but the rest of them, their bias is towards the establishment, towards incumbents, which of course are Democrats, right? One other thing I would add to that, and I've said this now for decades, why the powers that be, the Chamber of Commerce crowd, the folks who you would assume have a vested interest in increasing the numbers of Republicans in the legislature, why do they continue instead to invest in Democrats, including our Republican governor who has given to more Democrats in this cycle than Republicans? Why is that? And the answer is fairly simple. The Democratic Party is willing to maintain its hold on power by not sort of going too far in the direction of liberal policy. They are willing to be friendly in terms of tax policy to the Chamber of Commerce crowd. And so for the Chamber of Commerce crowd, they're saying, why would I invest in a Republican who might be some crazy social conservative when I can invest in an anti-tax Democrat 7 days a week and twice on Sunday? In other words, the Democratic Party maintains this dominance by not being too aggressive, by essentially giving establishment figures, especially major economic interests, what they want, right? And when you look at Massachusetts policy, Massachusetts may have had a label Taxachusetts 20 years ago. It's clearly not the case today, and the Democrats are the ones who essentially are responsible for that.
Can I ask a kind of a connected question? Does this exceptionalism translate into higher voter participation percentages?
Yes, and actually, that's a good question, and it has, in fact, at times done that. But that's only recent, actually, and that is consistent with other parts of the country based on the competitiveness of an election. But the interesting thing about an establishment-friendly place is you don't necessarily think about high turnout, you think about low turnout. All right? Low turnout elections is what makes it really hard to beat an incumbent. Right? So a lot of Massachusetts elections are very low turnout elections. The expectation that that's the case is why I believe this year 75–80% of the incumbents in the state legislature are unopposed, right? So there is an expectation that turnout will generally be low unless there's some big thing. Right now, the political media is doing their best to make a hay out of the fact that Democratic nominees for constitutional office are sort of ducking debates with Republicans, right? I guess if you have to, have a story every day, you got to have something. But the reality is they don't need to debate the GOP nominees for governor or for attorney general or for auditor. Well, maybe auditor. He's actually not a Trumper. But the point is that's the political media tries sometimes to generate the kind of left-right, spirit just to get people's attention. But the reality is it's kind of made up. Because those constitutional officers will all but one maybe win without any effort at all, really.
Another question.
Do you have some sort of mass hole infusion or pill that
I can't talk about that on the air, but yes, afterward, if you can establish that you know the secret handshake, we can have a conversation.
Okay. I would assume this makes, kind of just the idea, this must make a candidate hiring an out-of-state political organization or agency to run their campaign. Right. That doesn't work.
It really is an issue, and it's amazing it's amazing to me that candidates left and right just keep trying as if they didn't win last time because the establishment rigged it. I mean, that sounds familiar, but the reality is there's just such a commitment to the idea that we're Americans, and obviously we hate politicians, and obviously we hate deal making behind closed doors, right? So that's going to always be potent. And if we lost, it's just that we didn't get our message out. Or if we lost, it's because the other guy refused to debate me. Or if we lost, it's because they drowned me with superior resources, right? Those are the excuses that sustain the same old, insanity, which is the Massachusetts voters are progressive. And by God, they would express their progressivism if they could just hear my message without, that interference from the insiders.
Within all of the exceptionalism you're talking about, is there any kind of dynamics that go on, I guess you'd say basically within the Democratic Party in terms of regional dynamics?
Well, that's actually a very interesting question. I happen to be technically the the Western mass politics prof. And in Massachusetts, basically, politics in terms of the importance of local issues radiates out from the hub, from Boston, right? Western Massachusetts, if you judge that as Worcester West, right? Only 11% of the population lives from Worcester West, right? So it's been a long-running thing that the Western Massachusetts region is even less interested in your party label because they're more interested in making sure that they get their fair share out of Beacon Hill. So if you're running for public office in Western Mass, if you're running for the state legislature, that's your major plank all the time. You got to get me down there. I'm going to make sure we get ours. And it's important to note that in Massachusetts, in Western Mass, we have a sprinkling of Republican legislators, and they're just as in the know and insiders with the Western Mass political establishment as are Democrats. A lesson that I interestingly learned many years ago when I was attempting to help a candidate for what was he running for? A court clerk candidate. I was trying to help that guy get a useful endorsement, and I went to the hoped for endorser to say, people look to you as the leading Democrat around here. Would you be willing to? And I quickly got a lesson. Absolutely not. My good friend, Republican State Senator Blank, is running for that job, and he's been with us all along, and we're giving him our. So that's what I mean when I say there's really not a lot of left-right. And when you try to create left-right energy, it doesn't work, right? Especially in Western Mass, where everybody just cares about getting their fair share, which should tell you that they're sort of materialistic, wanting their people to go get us some stuff, not wanting them to save the world or to reform the world or what have you. And that really is the most durable thing about Massachusetts politics. And while there is some progress, arguably, in improving, or at least coming to grips with the fact that we are the least transparent state in America. We are the only state in America where if you're an incumbent politician, you automatically get first billing on the ballot. There's a whole bunch of comical, sort of true, real laws that are obviously designed to help the incumbents. Like, for example, making sure that the primaries don't happen until September. Right? Why is that? And to qualify for those, you've got to do everything before like May, or actually March, right? So obviously these are all the calendars, the rules, everything is openly rigged, if you will, and I hesitate to use the word, structured to give incumbents a huge advantage, which they are happy to have, and there doesn't seem to be enough public outcry about to change.
Thank you very much, Jerry.
Thank you.
Exceptional.